Welcome to the Revenue Above Replacement podcast. I'm your host, Adam Grossman. With me today is Mike Morris. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Adam, great to see you. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to
Always
be.
great to, always great to see you. Looking forward to the conversation. We want to start off how we start off with all of our guests. Tell us a little bit about your career to date and how you got to where you are in the sports industry.
Well, I'd like to. I often say I'm just an IT guy that was blessed to work in sports for 25 plus years, which makes it somewhat interesting for your students and listeners. But I graduated college with a Bachelor of Business and a focus on computer information systems. Started my career as a programmer. Out of college, I worked for EDS, great company founded by Ross Perot. I went through their systems engineer development program, which is a very structured, very difficult program where you learn how to write software the right way. I made the choice. EDS was a great company, really focused on employee development. Coming out of college, I think I needed that. I had a couple of job offers and went with EDS because of the structured, rigorous program. And I think that was, a very good decision. My first project in EDS was in the Government Services Division. I worked for the INS, now known as Department of Homeland Security. And there's a standard of software development called the Capability Maturity Model. And I worked on this project that was a CMM level 2 project, which means that we wrote really good software, as close to error-free software as I've ever seen in my career, very slowly and very expensively. And enjoyed that, learned how to, again, write software and learn about software and systems process right out of the gate. I think a hallmark of my career is there's a bunch of contrasts and I think that you learn from the diversity of experiences, and the contrast always helps develop your career. After working in government services, my next project was a commercial account in the airline industry, and may surprise you, but it was the exact opposite of the government contract. It lacked process. We were writing software very quickly with lots of defects, and it was a shock to the system. And someone who had just gone through that training program and understand the right way to do software. And then I spent my career vacillating from driving process and excellence and trying to get a lot done with a little of the process. And I have lots of examples later on in my career where, I applied that. So that was a, particularly interesting experience to start my career in very process oriented environment. And then kind of the wild, wild west. So I worked for EDS for 4 or 5 years. I moved out to LA and worked on a couple of contracts there. I then moved to PricewaterhouseCoopers and moved to New York City. I worked in a number of industries. I worked for UPS. I worked in the insurance industry. And then I had a sports client. And as is common in consulting, most of your clients, if you're lucky, you get a job offer out of them. And quite frankly, until that point, I wasn't interested in leaving PricewaterhouseCoopers at that time, and didn't find the content that interesting. But when I had my first sports client, I had a eureka moment and said, wow, this is, I really loved the content. I really loved the people. I was always a big sports fan. And, it wasn't until I was 24, 25 years old that, I said, geez, I really want to work in sports. Lo and behold, one of the next projects that I had an option to go work on was Major League Baseball. I always love origin stories into sports. And everyone has one. You talk to people in sports, and usually it requires a back step. And I have a couple of those in respect to getting sports. But I remember I had a new project. things were going great at PwC. My partner had told me that, soon, it was a couple years from going on deck to be partner, and I was excited about that. And then this Major League Baseball project came up, and it was a small project. It was managing 2 or 3 people. And, the other option was a big project managing 60, 70 people in a big insurance company. And I said, I would like to work at the baseball project. He said, no, that's a terrible idea. But again, I had developed a passion for sports, and I made that decision based on that passion and went into that. That turned out, worked for a couple years for the commissioner's office under the auspices as an advisor from PwC, and then I was offered a job at Major League Baseball. Another one of those points that I was a couple years from partner. They offered me a job as a project manager, and I it was, by all accounts, a step back from a position perspective. And, went through a lot of thought there, and ultimately made the decision that I was going to kind of believe in myself. It was an ability to get into sports, full time, and, took that job. I then worked in a technology position, almost in every single position possible at Major League Baseball. I started as a project manager, was, development manager, vice president of IT, the IT operations, almost every role. I was at Major League Baseball for about 14 years. Ultimately, I was the chief technology officer of the league, and served in that role for about 7 of those 14 years. That was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful time to be in baseball at that time. My original boss at baseball got the job and deployed the first computer, at
Wow.
baseball. So it was a different
Wow.
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a different time. A guy that well, Oscar Fernandez, had worked with me at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where we had built the first analytical system that baseball had used. It was a tool in arbitration that we
Yeah.
used for arbitration that we built. And that was one of my kind of first, tastes of an analytical tool that really proved to me, and I've seen this overplay over and over again in my career, how powerful and impactful analytical systems can be for an organization. When we built that system, we went against the union in the normal arbitration system process, and we beat them pretty handily, having this new system. The union then went to IBM, built their own system, and kind of a little bit of an arms race, started. So I hired Oscar at the commissioner's office. I joined first, and then I hired him as kind of head of analytics, the first analytics person. And within 2 or 3 years, we were spending millions of dollars on analytical systems. And then the whole sabermetrics movement came, and it was just really, what a blessing to be in baseball at that time, and to see the growth of technology. At my time at baseball, we started MLB Advanced Media, 1999, started an MLB network. It was really, originally nascent days of technology and new ways of consuming media, and really just a blessing to be there and to, see that and to be part of that. So I worked at Major League Baseball until 2015. I left and I went to Legends Hospitality as their first CIO. Legends was started by Jerry Jones of the Dallas Cowboys and Steinbrenner's the New York Yankees. They had kind of caught fire in the market. They were a very fast growing company. When I joined, much, much smaller than they were now. They had 3 divisions, a few $100 million of revenue. I was on the management team, and again was their first CIO. Spent 6 years at Legends. Had experienced hyper growth during that. That was a wonderful experience. When I left, we had 6 operating areas, or well over $1 billion in revenue, lots of clients. We started and deployed Live Nation, the largest hospitality contract in the world at that time. Just really great experiences. Again, a totally contrasted experience to baseball, where at baseball, 14 years of baseball, and we were pretty stable. operationally sound, if you could justify an expense and go through a thoughtful process, usually it would get approved. And we wrote good software. We were rigorous from a process perspective. And Legends was very, very fast growing, high movement. And again, just my career is hallmark of it is lots of opposites, and really value that opposites. So I left Legends in 2021 after a successful private equity transaction. And I went back to my roots, back into the advisory business. Had a good outcome, and started to start my own advisory practice where clients are sports properties, a variety of early stage and mid-stage technology companies, also doing a bit of investing, personal investing, and supporting the investment communities in evaluating deals and going through some digital transformations and IT transformations on behalf of clients. So kind of back to my roots now, and really have enjoyed that. I've been doing that the last few years.
Yeah, it's really interesting about the contrast. I potentially want to dive into that more. And usually when I always say in the podcast, I like to start from the beginning, but actually, I do actually want to, for you, start at the beginning of your MLB career, because you mentioned three major kind of initiatives. And I just want to dive into all of those because they've all had a really interesting impact on the sports industry. You talked about the analytics system and arbitration. Can you talk a little bit more about, again, where was baseball analytics before then? And, you were saying like how the sabermetric revolution kind of had just started. So what was it like to be on the forefront of seeing that kind of wash over baseball? Bill James had written his seminal book, I think, in 1978, but it wasn't really until Moneyball, which I think was published in 2002 or 2001, that you really started to see it. And you seem to even be experiencing way before the general public. So can you just talk about like the impact of analytics, particularly being at the forefront of the analytics revolution in baseball?
Yeah. Um, there were always a lot of smart people in the commissioner's office, in
Yeah.
particular in the labor relations part, and there was sophisticated analysis of players. And, but in the beginning, people talked about Bill James and people had copies of the abstract, but it wasn't systematized, right? It was
Yeah.
not part of the fabric. And you didn't, it was individuals excelling in individual analysis. But that was a big part. That was kind of my part in this whole process. Is when I started, we had AS400 kind of mainframe type systems, mid-range, compute systems
Yeah.
for waivers and transactions. They were not integrated. They were disparate systems that essentially you would log into different systems to accomplish things. And my first role, and as a consultant and then as a full-time employee, when that project manager job, was to build a consolidated baseball information system. So that first project was to design a new waivers and transaction system. For an IT guy, I know a hell of a lot about waivers and player movements and roster management,
Yeah.
and all of those things. I
Yeah. It's
would,
like fantasy for real. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Fantasy
I
baseball.
would be lying if it didn't cross my mind of like, should I try to be a general manager, because I knew an awful lot
Yeah.
about the rules. And quite frankly, a lot of the people that ended up going very far, as general managers, were experts in those rules, so I was able to, what a great experience to be able
Yeah.
to design and codify, all of those rules. But what really helped the movement, for lack of a better term, was the consolidation of all that data, and to build
Yeah.
a system and a reporting mechanism that essentially, and provide that to the 30 clubs to really raise the parity of the data available, and that consolidated system just immediately begot many, many opportunities for analysis that then created a new, cycled and advanced from an innovation perspective. But, until we built a centralized, disable list, and data transactional system, we were unable to do, accurate injury analysis. right? Until
Yeah.
we integrated a drug testing system and all of these systems there. Every integration point, and as we worked on the data and collecting it, validating it, and getting good data, it really prepared the industry to take off with sabermetrics. And now there's just so much data and so integrated and available to everyone. But I mean, that was the limiting factor at the time. It was a lack of systems and a lack
Yeah.
of central entry. So I'd like to think I played a part in that at least.
Well, and then how did you, well, I think you played, it sounds like played a very big part. And then, this is like what you're talking about, where this seems like a relatively novel idea, even centralizing all of these systems so you could have a functional, capability of doing waivers, transactions, injuries. How did you explain that to 30 teams? And how did you explain how you were going to use this in the arbitration process? It's one thing we try to teach the students, particularly in my classes, you have to be able to communicate these types of concepts, particularly novel or complex concepts to people without a IT or quantitative background. So how did you go about explaining what you were doing to the 30 clubs?
Yeah, good point. I'm a technologist, but really I'm a change manager,
Yeah.
right? The successful technology leader is able to articulate what are the benefits of the system and to really understand what the users want. Um, so really, we it was a lot of education working with the 30 clubs. By the way, this is an industry that is not known for an openness to change, or at least at the time it wasn't
Yeah.
known for an openness to change. So there, I think fundamentally, in order to drive change, you need to drive value. So you need to understand and articulate what are the benefits to the end users and to all the constituents involved. And that was pretty darn easy here. I mean, they were using disparate systems. There was a lot of manual processes. It was high pressure jobs as an assistant general
Yeah.
manager in a baseball club. Even back then, it was a very high pressure job. You did
Yeah.
not want to make a mistake. There were codified rules, but you certainly didn't want to run askew of those rules. And part and parcel of this system, big part of the value was to improve that process. To make the entry of transactions, to make the arbitration of those rules, to codify those rules so that you didn't have to be a savant about the, special waivers or major league waivers or all the different
Yeah.
waiver types, that was systematized, and it made it, much easier and more administrative from a club perspective. So there was a lot of buy-in. I think there was a need for progress there. I think they saw that need. So, and we had a really good process where we involved all 30 clubs and went through a lot of training. It was a big change, but it was a big success. And, and I know that like that system and process, in and of itself, removed thousands of hours
Yeah.
of
Can
manual
imagine.
work and verification, if you look at it from a league level.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And like, it's amazing to think about how complex those transactions are now and like what had to be done previously before these kind of systems came into place.
The rules have always been written by very smart labor lawyers,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And they are very particular. And again, I mean, there are a number of general managers you can point to that are in their roles because they worked very hard, but in particular because they knew those rules very
Yes.
specifically, and they had written them in some cases, read them or were able to interpret them, great aplomb, and that was that's where they got. So it's interesting, we kind of federated that a little bit. We kind of removed the complexity of that, and
Yeah.
then you started to see a trend where a lot of the leaders in that group were less rules oriented and more strategy oriented,
Yeah.
more analytics and more talent based, as opposed to administratively based.
And I want to make sure we highlight that one, exactly what you just said, but two, one of the hardest parts about data and analytics is really just getting the data, systematizing it, making it accessible so then you can run the analysis. I mean, that's typically, estimates of 90% of data science is doing the things that you're talking about, which is systematizing and making the data so you actually can run your models and make everything, focus on strategy and analytics. That's obviously we could talk about that for a long
We
time.
could talk about
We got
that,
that
and
all
I mean,
day.
I am extremely passionate about that. I mean, my perspective on analytics is keep it simple
Yeah,
and keep it accurate.
yeah,
And it really is about the data. I mean, a lot of the advances, I mean, that's a great example of an advance of it really was about the availability and the
yeah,
integrity of the data
yeah,
for which so you can apply models to it and really do the analysis. But I have lots and lots of examples. I mean, I have a real near term example of that. A client that I'm helping right now, early stage product technology company, helping them try to improve their sales, and they're selling into the sports entertainment business. And this has happened a few weeks ago. I said, so tell me about your win loss ratio for clients, and they said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? And I said, well, geez, you haven't been around that long. Let's talk about, I mean, how many no's have you gotten? And the answer was, geez, they had to go back and determine that and say there's been about 40 people that have said, some have said yes, but about 40 people have said no. And I said, and you don't know why? And the answer was no. And I said, all right, well, here's the project. We're going to go determine why, and go back and determine. And what a fascinating exercise. So we go back, and the people that sold those projects, they knew probably 30 of the 40 as to why they got to know. And the other 10, I said, well, let's start making some phone calls, and
yeah,
asking the clients about that. And so we got all of that data to paper, and it turned out to be price, and it turned out to be product fit. And I said, well, what specifically about product fit? And so I don't know. Well, let's make a series of phone calls and determine that. And let's get all this data right now. And it turned out to be, one or two particular features
mm,
that's a competitive product, had. And we went through that process, and oh my, just gold in that.
yeah,
So here there are a couple of factors in that now we can control. We made a price change almost immediately, and more importantly, we identified the gap, and we are, in the midst of filling that gap, right? And they were blind to that. It was
yeah,
there, but they didn't have the data. And in this case, it wasn't that hard to go through it. But yeah, data that everyone nowadays, it was never, analytics was for a long time not considered sexy. It's now considered to be sexy. But let's always remember that, and you said it well, Adam. 90% of it is not. 90% of it of the effort is getting the data and the process and the systems right so that you can apply models. I mean, we are so blessed now with AI and a lot of advancements in modeling and stuff, but we are not yet blessed with having high integrity data, and that is still tough work. That is the lion's share of the business of analytics. It's not all about modeling. There's a lot of blocking and tackling in order to get the results we need.
yeah. And as we said, we could talk about this for longer. Probably, as I say with almost every guest, if we should have you back, maybe we'll just talk about that directly. But I do want to cover another kind of transformational aspect of the sports industry that was a part of baseball, which is MLB Advanced Media. You just talk about what that was and why the MLB decided to pursue that in the first place.
Yeah, that was prior to MLB Advanced Media. While there wasn't that much from a digital product and product marketing, I listened to your podcast with John Brody, and I worked with him in the commissioner's office during that time. And he talked about how great it was to see the consumption and the distribution of media change, over his time, in the league. And I got to see that too, and completely agree. MLB Advanced Media dramatically changed that landscape, and really is a good example of where centralization of a function and significant investment in a function raises the parity. Rising tide raises all ships. So there, the league consolidated all of their digital and media rights into one entity, and created MLB Advanced Media, and built a number of apps and a number of distribution platforms to do that for all 30 clubs. Now, the con on that was that each club didn't get to differentiate, and there was, it was more of a homogeneous product. But by all accounts, that was a humongous success. That was a strategically brilliant move that raised the parity of baseball's digital capabilities. And then, almost every league followed, that model, afterwards. That was a tremendous success. I always joke. So I was a leader in the commissioner's office, and we started MLB Advanced Media, and we hired the first people. And before you know it, there were 1,000 technologists in MLB Advanced Media, and I was in the commissioner's office. I really enjoyed that lens. My constituencies were the 30 clubs and governance
Yeah.
of the game, and waivers and transactions and centrally generated revenue. But, as a technologist, I might have made the wrong choice there. Staying there, I had a group of 40 or 50 people and great team, but our capabilities paled in comparison to the MLB Advanced Media capabilities.
And when you say like digital, like what exactly were the digital capabilities that came from advanced media? And what were like the apps you were working or MLB was working on, at least you were touching at that point?
Yeah, well, they certainly the ballpark app. They were, called the products different names or whatever. But they first off, it's the 30 websites, the 30 team
Yeah.
websites, right? And then the centralization of media rights and distributions, and being able to instrument sponsorships, league-wide sponsorships, instrument club-based sponsorships onto the digital front. And this was, again, as digital was really growing as a new distribution channel, driving a lot of revenue, a lot of exposure. Ticket sales fundamental
Yeah,
to
exactly.
to that process. They started to stream. That became an incredible product, and lots of
Yeah,
products
exactly.
around streaming, a whole brand new revenue source that they've done just such a tremendous job of growth, and one begets the other. The digital products are marketing the game and marketing different products of the game, and really turned into a whole ecosystem of different products and services.
And then what were you, because this builds into MLB Network. So how, what was it like to launch MLB Network? Obviously there's a lot of talk now about sports media, whether leagues should have their own networks and regional sports networks. It was a different time and it was a different era, and kind of thinking about the genesis of the rise of league-owned networks. What was it like what was the decision process, and what was it like to launch MLB Network?
Yeah, a wonderful experience, for me. It was the largest cable launch in history at
Wow.
the time. We had a great CEO, Tony Petiti, that came,
Mhm.
from traditional linear broadcasting. That was the CEO. We built a broadcast studio in Secaucus, hired all the people, started to capture all of the games, and put a lot of editorial and live content on. I think that was an extraordinary smart strategic move by the commissioner at the time. It was a great success, and again, that's where linear and digital and non-digital products really started to collide, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
intersection between MLB Advanced Media and the network, and years before we didn't even really see the synergies there, right?
Right. Right.
But it was a really tremendous experience to see that come together. It was a big success. For me as a technologist, to be able to build a broadcast studio and
Right.
go through that. I mean, that was, one of the elements that was so wonderful about that job was just not lacking for content. Lots of new challenges. Was blessed to be in technology my whole career, and to have this high rate of change, be able to learn. But that was a particularly interesting time and space, in baseball and sports, as we really went from just linear broadcasting to digital and other types of broadcasting, and really was a smash up of a bunch of different technologies, a bunch of new functions, new ways of doing commerce, new ways of distributing our
Yeah.
product, marketing our game. It was really tremendous.
And what would you say? And we want to move on to your time at Legends, but what would you say? Like a lot of those things that you just identified are strategies, tactics, um, opportunities that a lot of people who are entering the sports industry now or senior members are dealing with now. So, what would you say your initial learnings were from those experiences in terms of that mashup of all those different kind of distribution channels, revenue generation channels? What would you say were some key learnings from that time?
Um, well, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right?
Yeah.
In a rapid change environment, what you do is you just go do the next best thing. You just go do the job, and you be
Yeah.
open to the opportunities and the integration points. And I remember at times in that career, as we're going through lots of change and lots of being overwhelmed, for a minute, and then saying, well, there's about 1,000 tasks to go build this broadcast studio. So let me focus on that, and to
Yeah.
go through. And, uh, very insightful in hindsight.
Yeah.
During the time, you're just working a lot, trying to produce excellence, trying to develop a team to accomplish it all, trying to meet the objectives of all of the constituencies that were rapidly changing and
Yeah.
growing in lots of different ways. So in hindsight, uh, again, you just operate day to day and be open and do the best you can do during those times. There were lots of really smart leaders. Bud Selig was a visionary, tremendous commissioner. He believed in the people, and he was empowering the people to go, drive change. And
Mm.
I was, very pleased to have a part of that, to be able to, get a lot of the tasks done. And in hindsight, it's unbelievable to look back at it, of all the change. But during it, they can't see me on the podcast, but I'm bald, and that's from that's from a lot of tasks and a lot of doing the doing, during that process. And in hindsight, it's really neat what we accomplished. It was just a lot of long hours, and a fantastic team, that I was blessed to have, along the way.
Speaking of, obviously you were at MLB, you accomplished a lot. You decided to make the move to Legends. What was the impetus for the move to Legends? Why did you decide to make the change?
Yeah, just extremely fast growing company. I've always been passionate about the fan experience. I had an opportunity while I was at baseball to go join a hospitality company, and I didn't end up taking, that job, but it really resonated with me that the fan experience is largely hospitality in game. And I was very passionate about the fan experience. And it was an opportunity to join the leadership team, really be a part of the hyper growth of a company. Shervin Mir Shahimi was had just become president. I was his first hire, first CIO of the company.
Yeah.
It was, actually, when I ultimately got the CTO job in Major League Baseball, it was under the auspices of needing to do more. We'd gone through an IT transformation.
Yeah.
A public accounting firm came in and said, geez, you should be probably twice as big as you are, and you could be providing more services, products, and technology to the constituencies at baseball. I got the job and went through a transformation, was able to kind of double the staff and go through a big change at baseball. It was a similar opportunity at Legends. I was the first
Yeah.
CIO. They had grown a lot, and their systems and processes and technology maturity had not grown to the date. So that was the task at hand, and it was a formidable one. And it was an awful lot of fun. It was with that, there was such a pace of change from a growth perspective that we had to kind of fix and triage the current situation, get the team in the right place, get the business enabled in the right ways, but then just keeping up. We were doubling on basically an annual basis, adding lots of new business operating areas and lots of new clients. And that was a different environment. That was a
Yeah.
peak-backed, very entrepreneurial,
Yeah.
environment. It was the exact opposite of baseball, where we're blessed to be highly supported and have the opportunities to do things the right way. Like when we built the network, and MLB Advanced Media was done the right way with very, very smart people, with the appropriate resources, and a lot of innovation and a lot of you know development, a lot of process behind that. Legends was, and it was a tremendous success, a tremendous experience, but it was done in a different way.
Hmm.
Less resources,
Yeah.
the same rapid environment, same expectations, but things that we did at Legends versus baseball, was done with a fraction of the resources in a faster amount of time, similar to analogous to that government contract and going into the commercial and seeing, it was the Wild West. And boy, did I learn a lot. What a fantastic experience with that.
Yeah, you mentioned contrast and you brought it up again. So from your experience, seems like you like maybe potentially both environments, but you particularly seem to have a bend towards this is something we talk about a little bit in the classes is, taking entrepreneurial roles or projects in existing organizations. So how do you kind of, particularly when you're taking an entrepreneurial or trying to build something approach, how do you take that contrast of wanting to have rigor with obviously a fast paced and moving environment? How do you balance those competing priorities when you're thinking about large scale projects like you were working on?
Yeah, that is the trick. And you're right. I think I do vacillate towards the entrepreneurial and a little bit of the more risk taking. But I would argue that um, I do that because of my background and desire to have control and
Yeah,
process. Had it not been for the experiences of where I understand how to do it the right way, I love the application of process and structure in order to improve. I like making an impact. My whole career, I really like serving and making an impact. And a little bit of process goes a long way. So there have been many of instances where I've come into a somewhat chaotic situation and tried to apply a little process and a little rigor to it to fix it. And I think I'm still trying to get that right, Adam. I mean, it's what
yeah,
is the application? I mean, I think I fundamentally I lean towards I want to do a good job, and I believe in excellence. And I absolutely believe that if you apply good people and good process to something, it's going to get better. But there are commercial realities to that. And I've spent a career trying to determine what exactly is the right amount of process and rigor and people to apply to it. Fundamentally, it often comes down to people, right? I
yeah,
have been successful where I have in my career only but for my team. It is all about the people and understanding, getting the right people that think like you, that want excellence, but understand the realities of the business and realities of the
yeah.
situation. An early mentor of mine recommended a book called The Trusted Advisor, and it's a hallmark in the consulting industry. And I read that as a young person. That mentor also, he was my kind of my first manager at EDS, and he was my first manager um, when he was my manager when I had my first management job at like 23. I had got a
Wow.
team, was a team programming leader, and I remember going, at the time when he recommended the book. I remember going to him, and one of my employees uh, hadn't done something correctly, and I went to him and I said, I need your advice. Joe isn't cutting the mustard here and didn't accomplish this. And he said, well, um, does he work for you or do you work for him?
Hmm.
I said, well, he works for me. He says,
Yeah,
no, he doesn't. If Joe didn't accomplish something, that is your fault.
yeah,
You are a manager. And he really level set me and understood that, management is a service oriented. And I still today, if I have a team, I tell that team that I work for them. It is extremely important. It is my job to make them successful. Full stop. Unequivocally, it is my job to make the team around me successful, and that service oriented perspective. So I've spent a career really genuinely looking at that and asking the team what they need to be successful, empowering them to be successful. And, I found that, if you can simplify the management game and it's about making your team successful and understand that you need to provide direction, you need to provide strategy, you need to set the expectations for the outcomes, and, clearly articulate what is the expectation of the outcomes, but then listening to the team, trusting that they can go perform.
Yeah, we're getting towards the end of the episode, and I want to come back to what you look for in teammates in terms of people you would hire as our last question. But before we do that, I did want to apply that what you just talked about either at your time in Legends or in your time in your current advisory role. How do you apply all those lessons learned from a management, either management perspective, empowering teammates, getting things done in a trying to get novel things done, whether it's with Edge at Legends or some of the other projects you worked on. How did you think about applying that in a more tangible way, I guess, in specific projects or specific things you're working on, whether at Legends or in your advisory work?
Yeah. Well, I was across my career, I was blessed, with a few things. One was a number of mentors
Yeah.
that really taught me, that I learned and, always thought it was my responsibility to pass that on.
Yeah.
Right. So, some of the things that I learned early on from, that guy's name was Frank Valdivieso. And, I still to this day will think about it and can just hear Frank giving me, a piece of wisdom 25 years ago,
Yeah.
that I routinely and regularly pass on to my team. And I believe
Okay.
it's our responsibility to kind of pass that on. So how do I apply that? I apply that in everything that I do on a daily basis, all those lessons learned and kind of my core mantras, for success. And I pass that on and I try to hire people who are teachable, that are open. I think it's extremely important that you care about quality, you care about your constituents. When I talked about service-oriented leadership, that's something that I look for. Are you worried about and care about yourself, or do you care about others? And
Yeah.
I try to hire people who are interested in making the people around them successful and are willing to go through walls and do anything to make other people successful. People that understand that they will be successful by making other people successful. I'm constantly working for people. I would never like to think of myself as the boss. The constituents is the owner of the company, the owner of the team, my user base, my employees. I'm serving all of those constituencies at all times. And I think that if you do that, you'll end up getting good outcomes.
Well, I think you answered the final question even before we had a chance to fully ask it, which is what do you look for? So I think that's a good place to end. Mike, thank you very much. This is a very wide-ranging conversation. I do think, the conversation around analytics and data, we may have you back. Well, we will have you back for that as well. So I think we want to dive into that more. But Mike Morris, thank you for the time. Thank you for being a
It was
guest
a
on the
pleasure.
podcast. And yeah, we'll hopefully have you back on soon.
Thank you, Adam.